In October of 1881, a 30-second gunfight in a dusty Arizona town became one of the most famous moments in American history. Hollywood would later turn it into a classic Western, with men dressed in black dusters, villains marked by red sashes, and dialogue sharper than bullets. This is the true story of Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, the Cowboys, and the violence that transformed frontier justice into legend. Health Wealth Diary presents the real story behind the movie Tombstone. Tombstone wasn't born from gunfire, it was born from silver. Founded in 1879 after one of the richest silver strikes in the Southwest, Tombstone exploded almost overnight. By 1881, it was a booming frontier city with more than 100 saloons, countless brothels, gambling halls, boarding houses, and no real separation between law and profit. Where money rushed in, trouble followed. Cattle rustling, stagecoach robberies, smuggling across the Mexican border, political corruption, and vigilante justice were everyday realities. The town wasn't divided between good and evil, but between competing power structures, and soon, all of that power would collide around one family. The movie introduces Wyatt Earp as a weary lawman seeking peace, but history tells a different story. Wyatt Barry Stapp Earp was born on March 19, 1848 in Illinois, and spent his early adulthood drifting through the American frontier. In his 20s, he worked as a stagecoach driver, buffalo hunter, gambler, and occasionally on the wrong side of the law. At various points, he was accused of horse theft, election fraud, and even being a pimp. By 1870, at just 22 years old, Wyatt became a constable in Lamar, Missouri, where he married his first wife, Urilla Sutherland. She died of typhoid fever less than a year later while pregnant, sending Wyatt into a long spiral of gambling and drifting. By the mid-1870s, Wyatt moved to Kansas and reinvented himself as a lawman in Wichita and later Dodge City. There, he earned a reputation as a cool, intimidating enforcer, rarely firing his gun, but never backing down. It was in Dodge City that Wyatt learned a critical lesson. Law was not about justice. It was about control. It was around this time that Wyatt met his second wife, a prostitute named Celia Ann Mattie Blaylock. As depicted in the movie, Mattie suffered from severe headaches and became addicted to laudanum, a then common opiate and painkiller. Their relationship would only last 6 years. Shortly after Wyatt was made Chief Deputy Marshal of Dodge City, he began tracking notorious train robber Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, a trail which took him hundreds of miles away to Fort Griffin, Texas. It would be here that Wyatt would meet a man by the name of Doc Holliday. John Henry Holliday, better known as Doc Holliday, was born on August 14, 1851. Doc Holliday was not born a killer, he was born into comfort. A trained dentist from Georgia, Doc was educated, articulate, and refined, until tuberculosis destroyed his future. Diagnosed young and told he had limited time to live, Doc headed west where the dry air might slow the disease. Dentistry gave way to gambling, medicine gave way to whiskey, and restraint gave way to violence. By the time Doc reached Tombstone, he was living on borrowed time, and that made him fearless. The film portrays Doc Holliday as sarcastic, flamboyant, and lethal, and that portrayal is remarkably accurate. Doc had a sharp mind, a volatile temper, and an unshakable loyalty to Wyatt Earp formed years earlier in Dodge City. Wyatt and Doc's bond began when Wyatt was tracking Dirty Dave Rudabaugh in Texas. That pursuit led Wyatt to a saloon in Fort Griffin, where he was told to speak to a car dealer named Doc Holliday, who had recently played poker with the outlaw. Despite Doc's reputation for disliking lawmen, the two men connected immediately. Working together, they coordinated with Dodge City authorities, leading to Dirty Dave's capture. Soon after, Doc arrived in Dodge City himself, fleeing Texas after killing a man. He found work dealing cards and quickly became Wyatt's unofficial enforcer. In one infamous incident, cowboy Ed Morrison and his gang rode into town, firing guns and terrorizing citizens. When Ed Morrison confronted Wyatt inside the Long Branch Saloon, Doc appeared silently behind him, pressing a gun to his head and ordering him to surrender. By 1879, Dodge City had largely been brought under control, and Wyatt and his brothers, Virgil and Morgan, who were also lawmen, found themselves spending more time in brothels and gambling halls than gunfights. Believing their days as lawmen were behind them, the brothers, along with Doc Holliday, set their sights on Tombstone, Arizona. When Wyatt and his crew arrived in Tombstone, what they found was a town effectively controlled by the Cochise County Cowboys, a loose but dangerous collection of rustlers, thieves, and outlaws who had no intention of surrendering power. The Cowboys operated with protection from Cochise County Sheriff John Behan, allowing them to rustle cattle and rob Wells Fargo stagecoaches with little consequence. That changed when the Earp brothers accepted law enforcement roles in town and began disrupting their operations. Contrary to the movie's focus on Wyatt alone, real power in Tombstone belonged to Virgil Earp. Virgil was the city marshal and a deputy U.S. Marshal, the highest-ranking law officer in town. He enforced Tombstone's controversial ordinance banning firearms within city limits. That law would become the spark that ignited everything. Morgan Earp, often overshadowed in the film, was deeply involved as a deputy. He was quiet, loyal, and efficient. James and Warren Earp existed on the fringes, present but not central to the violence. The Earps were not lone heroes. They were a coordinated force, operating as both lawmen and businessmen, deeply invested in Tombstone's future. The movie portrays the Cowboys as a unified outlaw gang. In reality, they were a loose association of ranchers, smugglers, and suspected rustlers who resisted federal authority. They controlled Cochise County through intimidation and political alliances. Ike Clanton was loud, reckless, and chronically resentful. Raised in a family deeply involved in ranching, rustling, and border smuggling, Ike grew up in an environment where intimidation mattered more than precision. He drank heavily, talked aggressively, and cultivated a reputation through threats rather than action. Ike positioned himself as a spokesman for the Cowboys, but lacked the discipline or courage of men like Curly Bill and the McClory brothers. His volatile personality made him unpredictable, and his frequent public confrontations with the Earps escalated tensions that might otherwise have cooled. Ike was more instigator than gunfighter, but his mouth, his grudges, and his refusal to back down helped push Tombstone toward violence. Billy Clanton was everything his older brother was not. Younger, sharper, and more disciplined, Billy carried himself as a working cowboy rather than a barroom bully. He was deeply loyal to his family and deeply resentful of the Earps' growing influence in Cochise County. Unlike Ike, Billy did not rely on talk alone. He carried weapons, trained with them, and was willing to use force when cornered. Frank McClory was widely regarded as the most capable and intelligent member of the cowboy faction. A former soldier, he brought discipline and tactical thinking to a group otherwise driven by impulse. Frank was armed, prepared, and understood the stakes of the power struggle in Tombstone. Tom McClory remains one of the most debated figures in Tombstone history. Less disciplined than his brother Frank, Tom was known for his temper, drinking, and tendency to escalate conflicts emotionally rather than strategically. His role among the Cowboys was inconsistent, sometimes aggressive, sometimes careless, sometimes passive. Curly Bill Brocious was a violent outlaw with a documented history of killing. Curly Bill operated with predatory confidence. He used fear deliberately, understood how to dominate a territory, and thrived in environments where law was weak. He was unpredictable, heavily armed, and unconcerned with public opinion. Among the Cowboys, he represented the extreme, the point where intimidation turned into outright terror. His reputation was earned, not embellished. Johnny Ringo was not the cinematic villain of Tombstone. He was educated, introspective, and deeply unstable. He struggled with depression, he drank heavily, and was prone to isolation and periods of withdrawal. Ringo's violence was not fueled by ambition or profit, but by inner turmoil. Unlike Curly Bill's aggression or Ike's provocation, Ringo's danger lay in his unpredictability and detachment from consequence. Josephine Marcus was born in New York City in 1861 and raised in San Francisco, far from the frontier myth. She was educated, ambitious, and fiercely independent. By her late teens, she moved to Tombstone, Arizona, and began a relationship with Sheriff John Behan. Josephine's relationship with Wyatt Earp began quietly and controversially. At the time, Wyatt was still with Mattie Blaylock, a relationship that was slowly fading away. What bound Wyatt and Josephine together was not romance in the Hollywood sense, but alignment. Josephine admired Wyatt's discipline, confidence, and sense of control. Wyatt, in turn, found in Josephine something he had rarely known, a partner who understood both his ambition and his darkness. On October 26, 1881, the day of the gunfight at the OK Corral, Ike and Billy Clanton, along with the McClory brothers, planned to ambush Doc Holliday after he publicly humiliated Ike during a card game the night before. The Earps learned of the plot and moved to confront them. Dressed in black, with Doc Holliday wearing gray and reportedly whistling as he walked, the lawmen passed the OK Corral and entered a narrow alley off Fremont Street. Virgil Earp announced their intention to arrest the Cowboys, though he did not raise his weapon. To this day, it remains unknown who fired the first shot. What is known is that Doc Holliday's shotgun blast tore into Frank McClory, and moments later, after Tom McClory wounded Morgan Earp, Doc killed him as well. The entire gunfight lasted roughly 30 seconds. When it was over, 3 Cowboys lay dead. Ike Clanton reportedly ran away, leaving his younger brother Billy for dead, and the Earps and Holliday were arrested for murder, though they were later cleared of all charges. Months later, Virgil Earp was ambushed and permanently crippled. In March 1882, Morgan Earp was shot in the back while playing billiards in a saloon. He died in Wyatt's arms. The remaining Earp brothers escorted Morgan's body to Colton, California for burial. From that moment on, the rule of law no longer mattered. The Earp vendetta ride had begun. Over the following year, a federally deputized Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday led a posse across Arizona territory, hunting down those responsible for Morgan's death. Several of the Cowboys and their allies were killed, including a fatal shootout with Curly Bill Brocious. The movie gives us a poetic ending, Doc Holliday facing Johnny Ringo in a deadly showdown, but it never happened. Johnny Ringo was found dead in 1882, alone, with a gunshot wound to the head. Most historians believe it was suicide. No witnesses, no duel, no redemption arc, just a lonely death. After fleeing the gunfight at the OK Corral, Ike Clanton spent years accusing the Earps of murder. Eventually, he was shot and killed in May of 1887 in Springerville, Arizona. He was killed by lawman Jake Brighton while resisting arrest for cattle rustling. The film portrays Wyatt Earp's vendetta ride as righteous retribution. Historically, it was far more complicated. Wyatt was federally deputized, true, but many of the killings occurred without arrests, trials, or clear evidence. Some historians argue Wyatt crossed the line from lawman into vigilante. By May of 1882, Wyatt and Doc had had enough of Tombstone. With several suspects still unaccounted for, they left Arizona behind, traveling through New Mexico and eventually settling in Colorado. Wyatt worked as a private investigator while Doc's health continued to slowly deteriorate. The vendetta ride had drained Doc, and he was running out of time. His tuberculosis had worsened under months of cold nights, stress, gunfire, and hard living. His coughing fits were more frequent, and his strength was fading. In 1887, Doc arrived in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, checking into a hotel near the hot springs. The sulfur vapors were believed to ease consumption, but the illness had progressed too far. Doc spent his final weeks confined to bed, watched over by staff rather than friends. Wyatt Earp was not there. Their bond remained unbroken, but distance and time had taken over. On November 8, 1887, John Henry Doc Holliday died at the age of 36. Wyatt Earp lived on. He prospected for gold in Alaska and New Mexico, advised early Hollywood filmmakers, and helped shape the legend of the Old West itself. When he died in 1929, he left behind a life so extraordinary it would inspire generations of stories, none more enduring than Tombstone. For nearly 50 years, Josephine remained at Wyatt's side. She managed his image, protected his legacy, and aggressively shaped how history would remember him. Josephine Marcus Earp died on December 19, 1944. By the time Tombstone reached theaters in 1993, the story of Wyatt Earp and the gunfight at the OK Corral had already been told and retold for more than a century. What this film did differently was give the legend faces, voices, and performances that felt permanent. Kurt Russell carried the weight of Wyatt Earp as a man of control and calculation, portraying him not as a reckless gunfighter, but as a figure who understood power and restraint. His Wyatt is measured, intimidating, and deliberate, closer to the real man than many earlier portrayals. Val Kilmer's Doc Holliday became the film's defining performance. Sick, brilliant, violent, and razor-sharp, Kilmer captured both the charm and the decay of a man who knew he was dying and no longer feared consequences. For many viewers, this version of Doc Holliday is Doc Holliday. Sam Elliott brought quiet authority to Virgil Earp, portraying him as the true lawman of Tombstone, the man trying to enforce order in a town already sliding toward chaos. Bill Paxton's Morgan Earp added humanity and vulnerability, reminding audiences that not everyone in Tombstone was hardened for war. Powers Booth's Curly Bill Brocious embodied unrestrained violence, while Michael Bind's Johnny Ringo brought intelligence and menace to a character history paints far more enigmatic. Stephen Lang's portrayal of Ike Clanton captured the bluster and instability that defined the real man. Together, this cast did more than portray history. They defined how it would be remembered. Tombstone was never about good men versus bad men. It was about power, who enforced it, who resisted it, and who survived long enough to define it. The Earps were not saviors. They were enforcers who understood that order on the frontier was built with pressure, alliances, and violence when necessary. The Cowboys were not cartoon villains. They were a rival power structure protecting their own interests in a lawless economy. Tombstone, the film, gave us closure. Tombstone, the town, never had it. Because the real legacy of Tombstone isn't the shootouts. It's the reminder that in the Wild West, and often in history, the story that survives is written by the man who walks away. Thank you for watching. So now that the dust has settled and the guns are holstered, who was your favorite gunfighter in Tombstone, and why? Leave your answers in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, leave us a like. And don't forget to subscribe for more action-packed videos from the Health Wealth Diary.